Hello everyone, and really good to be in touch with you again. I hope everyone's doing really well. The purpose of this lecture today is to talk about what I think is one of the most fascinating, intriguing and important concepts that we have in relation to place, and that's the concept of heterotopias. Heterotopias are attributed to the French philosopher Michel Foucault, and we'll be talking about what the term itself actually means, looking at some examples of heterotopias, and then beginning to kind of scope what that might mean for ourselves in terms of the way that we frame the world. I've called this lecture The Mouse in the Mirror, Foucault's concept of heterotopias. And I've called it this because I was at a sort of householdy type shop, which shan't be named, Dunelm, a little while ago, and I came across this mirror, which, as you can see, is contains a ceramic mouse staring at an image of itself in the mirror. Now, I do actually have this object, which is unfortunately at present stranded on campus. So if I do get a chance, I will liberate it from the campus and bring it to show it to you in the seminar. But I was really intrigued by this because it evoked to me some of the key things that Foucault talks about when he talks about heterotopias. So here we have the mouse looking at itself in the mirror, wondering, is that really me, insofar as a mouse can do, trying to sort of interrogate the image that it sees in the mirror, and to understand what does that say about itself or about the world. Now, that may seem to be a bit of a stretch of the imagination, but I think when we do look at ourselves in the mirror, are we seeing ourselves in the way we expect to see, or do we see something entirely different? What is it that makes that difference? I have a friend who is mid-40s who has carried in his back pocket, in his wallet, a photo of himself as a child aged 9 or 10. And I remember seeing this photo of him, and I said, oh, that's a really nice photo of yourself as a kid. And he said, yeah, I carry that around with me because that's who I really am. And I just thought that was really interesting. So despite the passage of time, despite the way that maybe we may change physically, emotionally, psychologically, there are still certain central aspects of us that we see when we look at ourselves, or perhaps we don't see, or other people see. So hence the title of this lecture is The Mouse in the Mirror. So let's talk in a bit more detail about what heterotopias actually mean. So continuing this this theme that Foucault talks about, this quote I think is really instructive. Foucault says, from the standpoint of the mirror, I come back towards myself. I begin again to direct my eyes towards myself and to reconstitute myself where I am. And this notion of reconstituting ourselves through our image, whether it's in a mirror or whether it's externalized elsewhere, is really important. It's almost as though if Foucault had have been writing today, he may have even used the word pixelated. It's as though we've been shattered into lots of tiny pieces, and the medium in which we present ourselves means that when we are reconstituted in a different form, in a different context, our image might well have changed, whether it's an image in the mirror or whether it's an image that we have of ourselves or an image that other people have of ourselves. And I've just put some, again, I've just got some images here of, I love that little squirrel sort of trying to, it's almost as though it's saying, I really want to touch myself. I really want to see, is that really me? Can I touch my paw? It's kind of, there's a certain sort of, there's a recognition, but there's also this barrier. There's halls of mirrors you may have seen that are sort of alter our body shape and size, and they're for fun. Again, we look at ourselves in the mirror, we think, is that really me? If I was doing this lecture in the classroom, I'd pass around the Mouse in the mirror and I ask everyone to have a little look at themselves. In fact, I have a whole series of mirrors and just kind of say, does it feel like it's you? Or does it feel as though whilst your image, whilst the light is impacting on our reflection in the mirror, that somehow that has changed. So it's a really interesting concept to begin to think about, who we really are, and the lens through which the world can frame us. So I hope that that makes sense. I want to talk a little bit about Michel Foucault because he's one of my favorite philosophers, and he comes from a school of French philosophy that was sort of really, really popular and very influential in the 1950s and 60s. We do talk about French philosophers a lot on Place, Memory, Meaning, just to give you a heads up on that. Other philosophers are people like Michel de Certeau, and there's also Jean-Francois Lyotard, who we talk about, but we'll come back to those particular names later on. So Michel Foucault was a French philosopher, a teacher, a writer, and he was born in 1926 and died way before his time in 1984. And this quotation here you might recognize because I've put this on the front cover of the module guide for Place, Memory, Meaning. I love this quotation. It's something that I think evokes the whole sense of how our memory and our sense of place changes over time. So this first quote, I am hopefully in love with a memory, an echo from another time, another place. It's like an echo, it's like a sound effect that resonates with us that can open up a whole realm of thinking. The other really famous quotation attributed to Michel Foucault is, where there is power, there is resistance. And I think few would disagree with that claim. I've put some photos of Foucault so that you have a sense of what he looked like. Very important thinker, intellectual for ourselves today. So let's look at Heterotopia, but to begin that, we want to look at Utopia. We can see that Heterotopia is comprises two main words in a way: heter, which is the Greek for other, and topos, which is the Greek for place. But let's just go back to Utopia. There's different sort of strands of topia, topos, and Utopia, which is a term you've probably heard of, I'm sure, was first brought into common parlance by Thomas More, who was alive in 1478. Now we're really going back into the passage of time here. And Thomas More wrote a manifesto, which you can see was published by Penguin, very, very popular text, whereby he was imagining a world whereby war had been eradicated, greed had gone, and people had no need for money. And it's just nice just to pause and to think about what that world would be like. No greed, no competition, no need for money, the demise of capitalism. Well, it's interesting to think about how we would live in a world of that nature. We had a slight peak of it when capitalism collided to a halt as lockdown began to grip. Utopia itself means an imagined place, a state of mind where everything is perfect, or so we think. That's Thomas More. A little bit about when he was writing. And as I mentioned before, it comes from two different word stems: heterotopia, heter meaning other, and topia meaning place, or sometimes referred to as world. But heterotopias themselves are really worlds inside worlds, places which are embedded in aspects and stages of our lives and which somehow mirror and at the same time distort, unsettle, or invert other spaces. So let's have a little look in detail as to what we mean by that. Foucault and his collaborator Misevic in 1986 wrote, "There are other spaces that seem to be pure and simple openings, but that generally hide curious exclusions. Everyone can enter into these heterotopic sites, but in fact it is only an illusion. And if we think we enter where we are, but by the very fact that we enter, we are excluded." Now, that makes us think about, initially, heterotopias are somewhere that invite us in, but also have the capacity to exclude us when they, i.e. heterotopias, feel that the time is right, that you've outstayed your welcome, so to speak. Heterotopias discombobulate us because, according to Foucault, they destroy the syntax in advance, the rules around, you know, how we engage with this particular place. And not only the syntax with which we construct sentences, but also that less apparent syntax, which causes words and things next to and also opposite one another to hold together. So what he's saying is that Heterotopias discombobulate, they disturb us because they disrupt our thinking in a way, and that may only be suspended in time, but they have a profound impact on the way that we engage with a particular place. Now, this will make a bit more sense as we go on. Heterotopias are unreal or virtual places that open up behind the surface, places that are formed in the very founding of society. You know, they are worlds inside worlds. They are an ever-changing milieu, and in the words of Foucault, heterotopias represent a reservoir of the imagination. Okay, so I hope that these little sort of insights that I'm giving you initially on heterotopias begins to spark your own imagination, and it'll make a lot more sense as we go along. Worlds inside worlds. I've two personal examples here that I would like to share with you, almost as a sort of meditative exercise. Circuses conform to this notion of a heterotopia. They are worlds inside worlds. They invite us in, but they can also chuck us out, either when the time's up or when, you know, the performers feel that the time is right. The circus performers themselves have a particular image that they want to get across. They sometimes disrupt our thinking, our expectations of what the human body and mind is capable of doing. I love going to non-animal circuses, I should add, and I've always felt that I've always been curiously drawn to them. It goes back to when I was a child, and I sort of peeped under the curtains of one circus that came to where I was born, in a town called Coal Island, County Tyrone, which I'm going to talk about in my next example of heterotopias. This very modest circus would come to town every year, and for 3 or 4 years I used to go down with my brother and peep under the curtain and see all the performers and all these different characters, and I really loved it. And I do try and nip into a circus as and when I can, but they are absolutely a really good example of a heterotopia. You have these worlds inside worlds. They suspend us in animation for a short period of time, and then we withdraw and we go back to our ordinary lives. I have a second and perhaps maybe more somber example to share with you. I grew up in Northern Ireland, in Coal Island, County Tyrone, at the peak of the euphemistically called Northern Irish Troubles, when there was a lot of bombs, rifle fire, a lot of terrorist activity. Sometimes that was very frightening. Other times it felt like a safe place to live. And I want to just talk about this building here, which is the RUC Barracks, as was. And the RUC Barracks, RUC stands for the Royal Ulster Constabulary. And when the terrorist activities reached their peak in the early 1970s, people who were accused of being members of terrorist groups, namely the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, were arrested, and they were held in the barracks. The barracks was entirely closed off to us. The barracks itself was often bombed, actually, but it was closed off. It had electrified fences all the way around. No one really knew what went on in the barracks. We knew that people were taken there before they were transported to prison in Belfast, normally an infamous prison called H-Block. But no one really knew what went on, and you were certainly never allowed to look in, even remotely. The the fences that you see there, that's from a fairly recent photograph, but they were electrified and all blackened out, so you had no idea what was going on in there, and certainly people inside there would have had no contact with the outside world. And then I was back in County Tyrone 6 or 7 years ago, and my brother told me that the RUC Barracks had come on the market for sale, and would I like to go and have a look at it? And I thought, well, my interest was so piqued that I thought, well, I would be really interested to go and see what the barracks is actually like. I had all these memories flooding back to me from when I was a child, not knowing what the barracks were like, being intrigued, wanting to really think about what it would feel like to be in there. And so I decided I would go in with my brother. So we were talking really animatedly. But as we went down the steps, down the basement, we could see our tone of conversation change. We both became very serious. We both became very quiet. We were both, as we discovered later, imagining what life would be like for the prisoners who had been kept in the barracks. The walls were cold and dark. You could still see some of the chairs and some of the desks where the interrogations had been taking place. There were just casual things like old pens and pencils and bits of paper and phone numbers left, a pair of shoes left at the side of a chair. These sort of ordinary things that for me evoked a whole sense of memory. And it was for the very first time that I became reconnected with that part of my own past, which, even though 45 years had gone by, it still felt very, very real to me. So a very sobering experience. And then as we came out of the barracks and up into the daylight, again, we began to reconstitute ourselves in the way that Foucault talks about Heterotopia, in this case, the RUC barracks, sucking us in, as it did do with prisoners or suspected terrorists. And then when the time was right, chucking them out or taking them on to another Heterotopia. In Heterotopias, rules are very, very different, and our everyday life is often suspended in time. If you're interested in that period of history, please come and have a chat with me. I was a witness to pretty much all of it, so I could tell you a great deal about that period of history in the UK. So going back to Foucault, we're talking about, utopias and heterotopias. And I really love this quote from Foucault. He says, "I am interested in certain ones," i.e. sites, "that have the curious property of being in relation with all the other sites, but in such a way as to suspect, neutralize, or invert the set of relations that they happen to designate, mirror, or reflect. These spaces, as it were, which are linked with all the others, which, however, contradict all the other sites, are of two main types." So it's this notion that heterotopias will challenge what we're thinking, will challenge who we are, and will challenge our very understanding of place. It may be unsettling, but it may be also very comforting. It may be stimulating. It may be disruptive. We probably know that there's a time frame attached to our engagement with these places. So some examples of heterotopias. Foucault talks about crisis heterotopias. These are sometimes things like, Victorian asylums, workhouses, and I hope this year you'll have a lecture from my wonderful colleague Carolyn Gibbison, who talks about asylums and how they've changed over time. Utopias have this kind of crisis dimension to them, where events escalate to the extent where something has to give. They're often associated with deviation. The example of the RUC Barracks that I gave earlier is a really good instance of that. So they can apply to psychiatric hospitals, drug rehabilitation centres, residential care centres, residential care homes. If you think about the recent press coverage that care homes have had under COVID-19, no one really knew what was going on in care homes until someone took it upon themselves to look behind the curtain and to look at the validity of the statistics that was being represented to us. Because those worlds are often opaque, they're worlds inside worlds. Heterotopias often have what Foucault describes as a juxtaposition of elements. So they seem to be incongruent with each other. So classrooms is a really good example of this, I think, as a heterotopia. It's somewhere where we should be learning and we should be relaxed. But if we think about the way that the classrooms are presented in the Owen building, say, they're quite formal, aren't they? And lots of them are have the chairs set out as rows, which is not conducive to learning at all. Gardens can be heterotopias, and we had a student last year, Lara Flannery, who did this wonderful personal journey of place based on her grand's garden, which I'm hoping I will be able to show to you later on. Heterotopias can also be slices of time where people break away from their time. So Holocaust memorials, for example, Auschwitz, Ground Zero, cemeteries. They can also be places that are where time shifts or is multi-layered. Libraries, like where I am here today, is a really good example of, you have a series of books and those are a slice of time. The library stock will change over time, so we'll have a different representation of time. Here's some other really accessible examples of heterotopias. The space station, that's a world inside a world, outside our world, but inside all the worlds. Lots going on there. For Foucault, the archetypal heterotopia was the ship. Anyone who's been on a ship or on a cruise ship or has worked on a cruise ship will tell you that they have their own built-in institutions, they have their own built-in protocols, their own built-in way of doing things. We had a student a couple of years ago, Dom, who did this module, and he worked on a cruise ship for many months last year, and he was in contact with me and he was saying, oh gosh, this is such a heterotopia, Foucault was right. So that's really, really interesting. So don't just take my word for it, or Foucault's even, for that matter. Another example are hospitals. I hope that no one has had to be in hospital or go and see anyone in a hospital, but most people will have had the experience of being in a hospital at some point in their lives. They are worlds inside worlds. I'm always really intrigued by what we see visibly within hospitals, but what's also going on behind the scenes, those closed doors that we don't see. Airports are another really good example of that. And another student last year, Sophie, did her personal journey of place based on airports, and she drew on the concept of heterotopia to get her points across. These are the Winter Gardens in Sheffield, so you probably recognize that. I think that's a really nice example of a heterotopia. This is the British Library. For those of you who haven't been to the British Library, if you're planning to go to London, it's absolutely amazing. It is a world inside a world. There's also a lot going on behind the scenes. There's archives, there's rooms with activities and things. And in the words of Foucault, that is a slice of time. The Louvre in Paris, the wonderful museum, which again, because of the artifacts that are on show, gives us a census point in time, but also they have these enormous stacks, many of which are in the basement, that keep our interest going and keep the momentum of the museum mobilized. This is Ground Zero. For any of you who went to New York with us last year, you may have gone to Ground Zero. Ground Zero is it's a very somber point. I remember actually when the planes hit the Twin Towers, my son had not long been born. He was born in June 2001, and the planes hit obviously September the 11th of the same year, and the enormity of what had happened was just so difficult to process. When we go back we see what remains, very respectful way of representing those who lost their lives during that period. So it is a heterotopia. It is a world inside a world. Auschwitz, which I mentioned earlier, also a heterotopia. You know, people being brought in, many of them never leaving, the vast majority never leaving, and the different rules that went on, and of course the terrible atrocities that took place there. Some very sobering thoughts. Prisons are a form of heterotopia. Boarding schools, I think, also a form of heterotopia. Um, you know, Hogwarts, a heterotopia. Fairgrounds, music festivals, heterotopia. These are this is the old housing in Beijing in the Hutong alleyways, that's been in existence since the days of Marco Polo. But they're built in such a way that seeing inside them is actually really challenging. But when you do see inside them, you see that they're arranged as a quadrangle block where you have properties on each side sort of facing in. But from the outside, very difficult to know what's going on. So just a few more specifics about heterotopias. They are access controlled. They're generally not freely accessible. You know, you often have to be invited in or physically taken in. But whoever does occupy them must be aware that they need to observe certain rites, or what Foucault calls purifications. Rites as in rites of passage, rites, a way of doing something. So very difficult to, or very different to RIGTHS rights. Some heterotopias may be easy to access, but may be difficult to leave, and may need to be accessed in a different way. You know, servants' quarters, for example, which speaks volumes about social status. They have temporal qualities, i.e. are linked with time. In the words of Foucault again, more often than not, heterotopias are connected with temporal discontinuities. That is, they open onto what might be called heterochronias. Chronia, the word for time. The heterotopia begins to function fully when people are in a kind of absolute break with their traditional time. In some ways, the COVID-19 period could be seen as a heterotopia in its own right. Days seem to merge with one another. Those normal landmarks that we would have to constitute time, you know, unraveled pretty quickly, didn't they? So, you know, the way that our sense of time can be discombobulated, can be altered, can be disrupted is a really important aspect of heterotopias. So in the seminar which accompanies this lecture, I want you to think about heterotopias that you are familiar with. I've mentioned some, but as a really astute student, Ben, 3 or 4 years ago, said to me during this module, he said, Angela, is it not what isn't a heterotopia rather than what is? And that comment has stayed with me over the years. So think about heterotopias that you're familiar with, ones that appeal to you, ones that intrigue you. And in what way do Foucault's writings help us to understand these worlds within worlds? In what way are these ideas different? Or in what way are these ideas captivating to us? And thirdly, how do heterotopias help us create place? Either place as we find it, or place as it's reimagined or reconstituted in our own minds. I've got a reading list here, including an article that I had published in Irish Geography a couple of years ago based on research with the Irish community in Leicester who were living in the euphemistically called boarding houses, which were minimalist digs, and how they were worlds inside worlds with their own protocols and procedures, and how people could be invited in and then spat back out again. And very interesting analysis of the life of people in the boarding houses. I'll put that on the Blackboard side for you to have a look at. So I hope that that's been a helpful journey through Heterotopias. I hope it's a concept that appeals to you. You might well use this in your personal journey of place assessment. But meanwhile, as ever, do get in touch with any questions or queries, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon. So bye for now.